There was a sound in the dark that had no right to be there. Not a sound exactly. The galactic accord did not travel by ear. But when the deep field survey vessel distant measure crossed into the outer edge of a quiet spiral arm, its sensor arrays picked up something that stopped every automated process on the ship cold. The system flagged it as an anomaly. Then it flagged it again. Then it simply stopped filing reports and waited, as if it too did not know what category to put the thing in. Survey Commander Rull had been doing this work for 31 cycles. He had cataloged dying stars, mapped frozen moons, and filed reports on 4 pre-biological worlds in a single decade. His job was methodical and largely uneventful, which was exactly how he preferred it. So when Analyst Scythe walked into the command room without knocking, Rull already knew something was wrong. Scythe placed a data slab on the table. He did not speak. He just waited. Rull looked at the readings. Then he looked at them again. The source was a single planet, small, rocky, orbiting a yellow dwarf at comfortable distance. The Accord's old charts listed it under a survey number and nothing else. Assessed 400 years prior. Classification: uninhabited. Biologically active but presentient. No further review recommended. What the sensors were showing now was not a presentient world. The electromagnetic output alone was staggering. Thousands of signals layered on top of each other, running across every frequency band, crisscrossing the planet's atmosphere like a living web. Radio waves, encrypted military channels, compressed data bursts, commercial broadcasts, narrow-beam transmissions bouncing off objects in the planet's own orbit. The planet had put machines in the sky, hundreds of them. And beneath all of it, something stranger. A low, continuous pulse that Scythe had isolated from the noise. It was not random. It carried structure, pattern. Something inside it repeated at intervals too deliberate to be natural. Rull asked how long this had been going on. Scythe told him the question was harder than it sounded. The old survey records showed none of this. Between the last Accord assessment and now, 4 centuries had passed. Whatever had happened on that world had happened entirely without observation. There was no record of uplift, no record of contact, no record of any known civilization seeding the planet with technology. It had simply started talking. Rull filed a mandatory discovery report to the Accord Council and ordered the vessel to hold position at a distance that kept them outside the planet's likely detection range. The reply from the Council came back in 3 hours. It was dismissive, probably a late-stage pre-industrial emergence. Continue standard observation protocol. Do not engage. File a full assessment within 40 cycles. Rull set the report aside and told Scythe to keep working. Scythe worked through the night cycle without stopping. By the time Rull returned to the command room, Scythe had something new on his screen. He had managed to isolate one of the signals from the noise and decode a portion of it. It was a visual transmission, moving images with accompanying audio, and it was clearly a form of deliberate communication. The images showed the planet's surface, green land masses, blue water covering most of the globe, and everywhere structures, cities, roads, lights that turned the night side into a scattered mirror of the stars above it. The beings walking those streets were small, upright, bilaterally symmetrical, and entirely unremarkable in physical form. Except they had built all of that in 400 years. Rull stared at the night side image for a long time. The lights down there were not a curiosity or an anomaly. They were evidence of something the Accord's models had never accounted for. Something had happened on that small blue world that the galaxy had simply not been watching. Navigator Pell, the youngest member of the crew, drifted over to look at the screen. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Rull what they were called. Rull said they did not know yet. Pell watched the moving images for a while longer. The creatures down there were doing ordinary things, moving through their cities, talking to each other. One image showed a gathering of thousands of them in an open space, all facing a single figure who was speaking. Another showed a small group around a table, heads bent over something, working. Pal said they looked busy. Rull said nothing. He was thinking about the 400 years, about what it meant to go from silence to this kind of noise in a span of time that barely registered in Accord history, about what kind of creature could build a civilization that fast and still be sitting on the same rock it started on. He pulled up the old survey report. The assessors had noted biological life, noted no signs of organized intelligence, and moved on. 4 centuries later, the planet was covered in light and shouting at the sky in every direction at once. Scythe printed out a single frame from one of the intercepted broadcasts and put it on the table between them. It showed one of the creatures looking directly into a recording device, speaking with what appeared to be total conviction about something Scythe could not yet translate. Whatever it was saying, it did not look afraid. It did not look uncertain. It looked like something that had already decided it belonged exactly where it was standing. Rull picked up the image and held it. Outside the viewport, the planet turned slowly in the dark, pouring its noise into the void, utterly indifferent to whether anyone was listening. Someone was. The first thing Scythe did was look for the wars. Every spacefaring civilization in the Accord archive had wars in its past. That was not surprising. What the archive tracked was the pattern: how many, how severe, and how long recovery took afterward. Most species had 2 or 3 major conflicts before the development of interstellar travel. A few had 4. One notable species had 5, and their file carried a special notation describing them as extraordinarily turbulent. Humanity's file, as Scythe assembled it from intercepted transmissions and decoded archives, currently listed 11. Not 11 skirmishes. 11 events large enough to qualify, by Accord standards, as civilization-threatening conflicts. Wars that had reshaped borders, collapsed governments, destroyed entire cities, and in several cases killed significant portions of the global population within short periods of time. The Accord's predictive models were unambiguous on this point. A species that survived more than 3 such events without collapsing into permanent decline was a statistical impossibility. Scythe filed that note and kept reading. Diseases came next. Humanity had been struck repeatedly by biological events that spread across the entire planet and killed enormous numbers. Again, by Accord models, 2 such events within a civilization's early development period typically produced irreversible population fragility. The models allowed for recovery from 1. Humanity had survived not 2 but 7 significant biological catastrophes, some overlapping with the wars, some occurring in the brief gaps between them. Scythe stopped writing for a moment. He sat back and looked at the ceiling. Then he kept reading. The environmental record was perhaps the most baffling section. Humanity had spent approximately a century and a half actively degrading its own planet's atmosphere, disrupting climate systems that had taken millions of years to stabilize. The Accord had observed this pattern in 2 other developing species. Both had died. Humanity had identified the problem, argued about it loudly and publicly in its broadcast records for several decades, and then begun revering the damage. Imperfectly. Slowly, with significant internal disagreement at every step, but the reversal was real and measurable in the data. They had broken their own world, and then fixed it while simultaneously recovering from wars and diseases, and doing all the other things civilizations do. Rull read the preliminary summary over Scythe's shoulder. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been sitting at the edge of the room since they started. How? Scythe did not have an answer for the how. What he had was a secondary finding that he thought might be relevant. He had been working through the cultural archive alongside the historical data, and he had found something that did not fit neatly into any Accord category. Humanity told stories. Not unusual in itself. Most complex species developed narrative traditions. What was unusual was the scale and the purpose. They told stories about everything, about their history, including the worst parts of it. They built entire industries dedicated to producing fictional accounts of catastrophes that had not happened, exploring those scenarios in elaborate detail, and then distributing those stories to the general population as a form of entertainment. They appeared to use narrative as a way to process fear, rehearse responses to disaster, and maintain cultural memory of past failures. Navigator Pell had independently discovered the same thing and was deep in a collection of human fiction when Scythe found him. Pell looked up with an expression that Rull had never seen on him before. He said he had been reading accounts of humans imagining first contact with alien species, and he needed to tell them something important. He said the humans had been expecting this. Not specifically, not with any real knowledge, but the concept of meeting another civilization was not new to them. They had been thinking about it, writing about it, making images about it for over a century. They had imagined every possible version of how it might go, including the bad ones. Rull asked what conclusions they generally reached in those stories. Pell said the conclusions varied. Some stories ended in destruction, some in cooperation. But across nearly all of them, the human characters refused to stop being human regardless of what they encountered. They adapted, negotiated, and survived. Scythe added a note to his report. The species had spent generations mentally preparing for a moment it had no evidence would ever come. The preparation was cultural, not strategic. They had no space program capable of posing a threat to any Accord member. They had no weapons that could reach beyond their own atmosphere in any meaningful way. They were, by every material measure, not ready. But they had been thinking about it. And thinking, Scythe was beginning to suspect, was what this species did instead of the things that should have killed it. On Earth, though no one aboard the distant measure knew it yet, a young researcher named Priya Nath was working a night shift at a radio observatory in a high-altitude location, recalibrating equipment that had been giving inconsistent readings. The inconsistency was not instrument error. She had checked 3 times. There was a mass in high orbit that did not belong to any satellite her records listed. She sat with that information for a few minutes. Then she did what the data told her to do. She wrote it down, flagged it, and sent it up the chain. The chain, it turned out, went very far up very quickly. Scythe did not know any of this yet. He was still reading. The more he read, the less he understood. The Accord's standard contact classification system did not have a box for these creatures. He created a new category in his personal notes and labeled it Other. The Accord Council's response to Rull's second report arrived in a tone that Rull had learned, over 3 decades, to recognize as institutional discomfort dressed as authority. The Council acknowledged the anomalous development rate. They acknowledged the cultural complexity. They did not change the protocol. Observe. Do not engage. File the full assessment. They added one new line at the end. Under no circumstances initiate two-way communication with an unclassified biological civilization. Rull read the message twice, filed it, and then walked to Scythe's workstation and told him to prepare a transmission. He was not going to pretend he had not made that decision carefully. He had. The Accord protocol existed for good reasons. Premature contact had gone badly in the past, but those past cases involved species that had no awareness of a wider galaxy, no conceptual framework for what they were encountering. The humans already had that framework. They had been building it in their fiction for 100 years. More importantly, someone on that planet had already noticed the distant measure in orbit. If he did nothing, the first message humanity received from the galaxy would be silence. Rull did not think that was a good beginning. He composed something simple, a mathematical sequence. Prime numbers, then a geometric progression, then a set of wave function ratios that any species capable of building a satellite would eventually recognize as intentional. It was the oldest opening line in the contact lexicon. It said, "We are here, we are ordered, we are reaching." The transmission went out. Rull went to his quarters and did not sleep. 41 hours later, Scythe woke him. The reply had arrived. It was not a mathematical echo, the standard reciprocal response that contact theory predicted. The humans had taken the sequence apart, identified its internal logic, and then extended it. They had added 3 additional layers of progression that Rull's original transmission had not included, and then after the mathematics, they had attached something else entirely. Audio, 43 separate audio clips, each one a different voice, each one speaking a different language, each one beginning with the same sound. A short, open-voweled greeting that Scythe's translation system could not yet process, but that every member of the crew independently agreed sounded warm. Rull sat with the transmission for a long time, 41 hours. The Accord's theoretical response window for a species at this developmental stage was estimated at between 3 and 12 cycles. Humanity had responded in under 2 days. He asked Scythe how they had done it. Scythe said the mathematical portion was not complicated for a species that had reached orbital technology. What he could not explain was the audio attachment. Collecting 43 distinct language samples, coordinating their recording, and appending them to a transmission in 41 hours implied an organizational response that should not have been possible for a species with no established first contact infrastructure. What none of them knew was the story happening on the ground. Dr. Adira Voss had been at a linguistics conference when the call came. She was on a plane within 2 hours. By the time she landed, the response team was already assembled in a converted broadcast facility, working from Priya Nath's initial detection report and a set of emergency protocols that had been written 15 years earlier and never used. Voss looked at the mathematical signal, understood immediately what it was, and told the room they had one job: answer in a way that showed they were home. The extended mathematical sequence was her team's work. The audio clips were her idea. She wanted whoever was up there to understand immediately that they were not dealing with a single unified voice. Humanity was many things at once. They should know that from the start. Rull played the audio clips in sequence. He did not understand the words. The translation systems were still learning the phonology, but there was something in the rhythm of the voices, something in the way each one delivered that opening sound, that made the transmission feel less like a signal and more like a room full of people turning around at the same moment to look at you. Navigator Pell said it was the friendliest thing he had ever heard. Scythe said it was also strategically interesting. By sending 43 languages simultaneously, humanity had communicated something without saying it. There is no single speaker here. There is no one you can simply deal with. We are many. Rull composed a reply. He spent 4 hours on it. In the end, he kept it simple: a request for a stable frequency, an offer to slow the transmission rate for easier decoding, and a question. Not a diplomatic question, not a formal query about civilization type or developmental stage, just a question. He asked what they called themselves. The answer came back in 6 hours. 1 word in 43 languages, then a pause, then 2 words in the primary language of the response team. The first word was human across all the languages. The second and third took longer to translate. When the system returned its answer, Scythe read it aloud in the quiet command room. Hello, and then we wondered. Rull looked at the screen. Then he said quietly that he thought they were going to be fine. Pell asked how he could possibly know that. Rull said he did not know it. He just thought it. Somewhere below, past the atmosphere and the cities and the noise, Adira Voss was sitting in a broadcast facility listening to static and thinking something very similar. The debate inside the United Nations Emergency Contact Council lasted 9 days. It was not a debate about whether to continue communication. That ship had sailed the moment Voss sent the hello. It was a debate about what to say next. Several delegations argued for a curated presentation. humanity's achievements in science, medicine, art, and cooperation. A highlights package, something that communicated capability and goodwill without inviting unnecessary judgment. One delegate called it the sensible approach. Another called it the obvious approach. A third, with less diplomacy, called it the approach every species probably used when someone new was watching. Voss sat through all of it without speaking. When they finally gave her the floor, she said one thing: they have already seen our broadcasts. They have been in orbit long enough to intercept a century of our transmissions. Whatever we send them now, they will compare it to what they already know. If we send them a highlight reel, they will know it is a highlight reel. And we will have taught them in our very first deliberate act that we perform rather than speak. The room was quiet for a moment. Secretary General Boateng, who had said almost nothing for 2 days, asked her what she was suggesting. Voss said she was suggesting they send everything. Not literally everything, but a comprehensive historical record, the real one, wars included, famines included, the periods where things went badly wrong and the periods where things went slightly less wrong, the debates and the failures and the corrections, and alongside all of that, the science, the art, and the moments when humans had looked at each other across impossible differences and chosen to build something instead of burn it. Boateng called a closed vote. The result was not unanimous, but it passed. The transmission package took 11 days to compile and took 4 hours to send. It was the largest deliberate transmission humanity had ever produced. Aboard the distant measure, the package arrived while Rull was in the middle of a tense sub-channel communication with the Accord Council, who had now received his report about the two-way contact and were not pleased. He paused that conversation, looked at the size of the incoming data, and told Scythe to begin processing immediately. Scythe processed it for 36 hours. When he came out of his workstation alcove, he looked like someone who had read something he could not unread. He told Rull the humans had sent them their actual history. Not a summary, not a selection. The real record, including a section that appeared to be a direct acknowledgement of the package's own limitations, noting that any historical account carries the biases of those who compile it, and that the receiving party should be aware that the humans themselves disagree about parts of what was included. Rull stared at that for a long time. They had flagged their own blind spots in the document. Scythe continued. The conflicts in the record were not minimized. Some of them were presented with what appeared to be deliberate detail, including the moments where humanity's own institutions had failed their own populations. There were sections that seemed to exist for no other purpose than to say, "This happened, we did this, we are not going to pretend otherwise." And then, alongside all of that, something Scythe had not expected: evidence of recovery, not just material recovery, conceptual recovery. After each major failure, there were records of the humans actively arguing about what had gone wrong, changing their systems, writing new rules, and building structures specifically designed to prevent the same failure from happening again. They did not always succeed, but they kept doing it. Rull sent a brief acknowledgement to the council. The contact package has been received and is under analysis. Then he returned to the data. Navigator Pell had found something in the cultural section that he brought to Rull quietly, almost privately. It was a category of human expression he described as memorial. Statues, buildings, ceremonies, written records maintained over centuries, all dedicated to events that were not achievements. Events that were disasters and losses and things that should not have happened. Humanity had built permanent structures to remember its worst moments, not to celebrate them. To make sure no one forgot. Pell said he had searched the Accord's cultural archives for a parallel. He had not found one. The Accord preserved its achievements. It did not, as a cultural practice, preserve its failures in the same physical, deliberate way. Rull asked him what he thought that meant. Pell said he thought it meant the humans were afraid of forgetting, and that they had decided the correct response to that fear was to build things that would remember even if the people did not. That evening, Rull sent a message to Voss. It was not an official transmission. It was not logged through the formal contact channel. He sent it on the secondary frequency they had established for translation calibration, and he kept it short. He told her that he had read the document. He asked her why they had included the failures. Her reply came 8 hours later, one sentence. Because if we only showed you the good parts, you would eventually see the rest anyway, and then you would know we were not honest. And honesty is the only thing we actually have to offer right now. Rull read that sentence 4 times. Then he went to find Scythe and told him to prepare a full crew briefing. He had a feeling they were all going to need to sit down together and talk about what came next. The leak happened on the 14th day. Someone in the lower tiers of the Accord's administrative network forwarded Scythe's compiled humanity report to a secondary data channel used mostly by researchers and academic observers. Within 6 hours, it had been copied, forwarded, and discussed by 40 separate institutions across 11 member species. Within 2 days, it was everywhere. The Accord Council was furious. The leak's origin was never formally identified, though internal suspicion settled quickly on Scythe, who denied it without much visible effort. The reaction across the galaxy was not uniform. 3 member species formally requested access to the complete data package. 2 species with historical concerns about uncontrolled biological development filed emergency objections and demanded that the distant measure be recalled. 1 species, whose communication style was famously terse, sent a single query that Scythe translated as, "Are they dangerous?" He was not sure how to answer that accurately, so he answered it honestly. It depends on what they are protecting. Most striking of all was the reaction from a mid-tier civilization called the Fen, who had been members of the Accord for roughly 2 centuries. They sent Rull a private message, bypassing council channels entirely. It read, "We have read the report. We have questions. We believe you understand why we do not want to ask them through official channels. Please advise." Rull replied that he understood, and that he would pass their contact information to the human team when the time was appropriate. On Earth, Voss was informed that 17 vessels had now been detected in or approaching the solar system. Colonel Danzig, who had been managing military observation of the contact process with controlled patients, looked at the number and asked whether this constituted a gathering or an assembly. Voss said she thought the word was audience. Danzig said that was not particularly reassuring. Voss said it was not supposed to be reassuring. It was supposed to be accurate. Priya Nath, who had not left the observatory for 2 weeks except to sleep, had been tracking each new arrival. She had a running list on a whiteboard she refused to photograph. She said writing it by hand made it feel more real. The vessels were not behaving aggressively. They were holding at various distances, some further out than others, all of them quiet, watching. Boateng addressed the full UN Council in a closed session. He told them that the next phase of contact would not just be with the crew of 1 survey vessel. The situation had expanded. Humanity was being observed by an audience whose full composition and intentions they did not yet know, and they had to make decisions accordingly. Someone asked if they should be afraid. Boateng said that was the wrong question. He said the right question was whether they were prepared. He paused. Then he said, "We are not, but we never have been for anything, and that has not stopped us yet." Rull sent a formal communication to the Accord Council, notifying them that the contact situation had materially changed, and that the standard 2-party protocol was no longer sufficient. He recommended that a formal multi-party contact framework be established, and that humanity be consulted as a participant, not a subject. The Council's response was the longest silence Rull had received in his career. It lasted 4 days. When the reply came, it was careful and bureaucratic, and ultimately, for the first time since the contact began, it contained a concession. The council would convene a preliminary classification hearing. Humanity's developmental record and contact behavior would be formally reviewed. Rull was ordered to prepare a summary document. He asked Scythe to help. Scythe had been waiting for this. The summary they produced was not long. Rull had a rule about summary documents. If you could not say it clearly, you did not understand it yet. The document was 4 pages. It contained the developmental data, the contact behavior record, and one additional section that Rull had written himself, late at night, without assistance. That section contained a single argument. It said that humanity did not fit the Accord's existing contact classifications, because those classifications were built on assumptions about civilizational behavior that humanity consistently violated. It said this was not a failure of humanity. It was a limitation of the classifications. And it said that the correct response to an entity that does not fit any existing category was not to force it into the nearest available box. It was to make a new box. Voss, who did not know about the document, was simultaneously writing something of her own. She was writing a proposed framework for multi-species contact, grounded in the principle that no single civilization's protocol should determine the terms of a meeting between 2 or more distinct worlds. She sent it through the contact channel addressed to Rull personally, nodding at the top that it was not an official UN position. It was her own thinking, offered freely, for whatever use he might find. Rull read it twice. Then he added it as an appendix to his summary document and submitted both to the Accord Council without asking permission. Outside the viewport, the ships kept coming, 17 so far, then 18. Then, at the edge of sensor range, a 19th. Pell tracked them all. He had started keeping his own list. Unlike Priya's whiteboard, his was filed in the formal record system. He labeled the folder Witnesses. The Accord Council voted on a Tuesday, though that word meant nothing to anyone aboard the distant measure. The formal classification hearing had lasted 6 days and been attended, in various forms, by representatives from 22 species. Grand Speaker Dorath had opened it with a summary of the contact record and a statement that the Council's role was to apply existing frameworks fairly and without sentiment. He had said the word sentiment the way someone says a word they are not entirely comfortable with anymore. The vote was not close. 17 in favor, 4 abstaining, 1 against. Humanity was designated a sovereign contact species. It was not membership in the Accord. It was not an alliance. It was a formal recognition that humanity existed as a peer civilization and would be treated as such under Accord protocols. The last time this designation had been extended to a new species was 312 years ago. Rull received notification of the result at the same time as Voss, the council having agreed, at his quiet insistence, that both parties should be informed simultaneously rather than sequentially. Voss read the notification in a room with 14 other people. She read it twice, out loud the second time. When she finished, no one spoke for a moment. Then someone in the back of the room started clapping, and then everyone was, and the sound was ridiculous and genuine, and Voss found that she did not mind it at all. Boateng held a brief public address. He did not announce the full classification language because the translation was still being finalized, and he did not want the press to run with a rough draft. He said only that humanity had been formally recognized by the broader galactic community, that this was a beginning and not an end, and that the work ahead would be harder and more important than anything that had come before. He said it in the same flat, steady tone he said everything, which was why people trusted him. Danzig watched the address from a side room. He had been increasingly quiet in the past week. Voss asked him what he was thinking. He said he was thinking about his job. His job had been to protect Earth during first contact. He said it was a strange thing to be a soldier in a situation where the only weapon that actually worked was telling the truth. The formal invitation for a human delegation to travel to the nearest Accord station arrived through official channels 48 hours after the vote. It was addressed to the UN Council. Rull sent a second copy directly to Voss with a note that simply said, "I hope you will be there." She would be. They all argued about the rest. The delegation assembly process took 2 months. The UN framework insisted on geographic and cultural representation. Various governments lobbied for their own candidates. Scientific bodies submitted nominations. Danzig nominated himself, was rejected on procedural grounds, and accepted the decision with more grace than anyone expected. The final 5 were Voss, who was the obvious choice and had never tried to be otherwise. A retired civil engineer from Lagos named Akin, who had spent 40 years building water infrastructure in difficult places, and who Boateng personally selected because, he said, he wanted someone who understood that civilization was not an idea but a practice. A climate scientist from Bolivia named Rasura, who had been tracking atmospheric recovery data for 2 decades, and who asked, on being selected, whether she could bring her field notebooks. A poet from Osaka named Haruki, 81 years old, who had written about impermanence his entire life and who said, when informed of the invitation, that he had been expecting something like this, though not quite so literally. And Priya Nath, whose original detection report had started everything, and who cried when she was told and did not apologize for it. The vessel that came to collect them was not Accord built. It was something new, a design Scythe had proposed, and the Accord's construction teams had assembled in record time specifically for this purpose. Rull had insisted it not look like an Accord military vessel. He wanted the humans to feel like guests, not cargo. Voss boarded first. Rull met her at the entry corridor. They had spoken for months through transmissions. This was the first time they stood in the same room. He was taller than she had imagined, and she was shorter than he had imagined, and they both stood there for a moment processing the simple fact of physical reality after all those months of voices. She said hello. He said hello back. Then they both laughed at the fact that that was still, after everything, the word they reached for. The 5 delegates pressed against the viewport as the vessel cleared Earth's orbit. No one said anything. Below them the planet turned, small and blue and impossibly full of noise, and all 5 of them looked at it in the particular way that humans look at something they love and are leaving. Priya pressed her hand against the glass. The planet turned. The stars held still. Back on the surface, in a high-altitude observatory that smelled like old equipment and instant meals, the chair where Priya had sat for 2 weeks was still there. Her whiteboard was still there. The list of 19 vessels was still written on it in her handwriting, each one tracked, each one named, none of them erased. Outside the window, the sky was dark and full, and for the first time in human history, every single light in it had a chance of looking back.